On the night of March 31st, 2026, in a quiet residential neighborhood in western Tehran called Chitgar, a video was recorded that tells you everything you need to know about where Iran is right now. A man in plain clothes stands in the street below a tall apartment building. He is holding an assault rifle equipped with a green laser sight. From the upper floors of the building above him, voices can be heard. Ordinary Iranians standing at their windows and on their balconies in the dark, chanting against their new supreme leader, against the IRGC, against the system that has spent the last 3 months killing tens of thousands of their fellow citizens. "What is he pointing at?" asks the man holding the camera. Then comes the crack of gunfire echoing between the residential buildings. A regime enforcer, alone in a street, pointing an assault rifle at people chanting in their own homes, firing at voices, firing at the dark. That video went global within hours, and it captures with terrible precision the nature of the crisis the Islamic Republic is now facing. A government so desperate to suppress the sound of its own people that it is shooting into apartment buildings in the middle of the night. Not because it is winning, but because it has run out of every other option. Because here is the fact that the regime's state media will never report. The IRGC, the very organization that put those snipers on the rooftops of Tehran in January that killed tens of thousands of Iranians in 2 days, that is pointing assault rifles at apartment windows in March, is now cracking from within. Factions inside the Revolutionary Guard are clashing openly over war strategy, over diplomacy, over who actually controls the invisible supreme leader, and over whether the entire leadership structure that Mojtaba Khamenei nominally heads has any legitimate authority at all. Senior figures in the Islamic Republic's own intelligence establishment warned, before Mojtaba was even appointed, that hereditary succession would hand the country to the Revolutionary Guard and permanently sideline civilian institutions. That warning has proved entirely accurate. And now the Revolutionary Guard is consuming itself while the people it was created to protect are chanting from their rooftops with guns pointed at them. Today, we are going to take you through the full story. The deadly riots that shook Iran, the massacre that followed, the IRGC's, internal fracture that no one inside Tehran's propaganda machine can hide, and the extraordinary question that haunts every intelligence agency watching this story unfold: how much longer can a regime govern a country by shooting at windows? On December 28, 2025, the shopkeepers of Tehran pulled down their shutters and stepped into the street. They were not politicians. They were not opposition activists. They were merchants, traders, and small business owners who had reached the end of what they could endure. The Iranian rial had crashed to a record low of 44 million per US dollar that same day, triggering panic buying and a desperate rush to convert savings into anything more stable. Annual inflation had climbed above 52% by late December. Food prices had become unreachable. Power cuts were regular. Water shortages in Tehran had grown so severe that President Masoud Pezeshkian had publicly floated the idea of relocating the capital. The Iranian economy was not struggling. It was collapsing in real time, and the people living inside it had run out of patience. The protests that began that afternoon spread with a velocity that none of Iran's security services had anticipated. Within days, not weeks, within the first 72 hours, demonstrations had erupted across more than 200 cities, touching all 31 of Iran's provinces. From the Kurdish northwest to the Baluchi southeast, from Tehran's Grand Bazaar to the coastal cities of the Persian Gulf, the country rose simultaneously. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies documented 574 distinct protest locations across 185 cities, making this the most sustained and geographically expansive uprising in the Islamic Republic's 47-year history. The Economist called it the biggest since the Green Movement of 2009. Veteran Iran analysts said it was the biggest since 1979 itself. The chants told the story of a movement that had moved far beyond economic grievance within days. In Zanjan, protesters called for Khamenei to be toppled this year. In Kemieh, crowds tore down a statue of Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC commander the regime had declared Iran's greatest martyr, and threw it to the ground. In Mashhad, protesters tore down and shredded the flag of the Islamic Republic. Across Tehran, a viral trend spread on social media: women lighting cigarettes to burn photographs of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Burning a portrait of the Supreme Leader is a serious criminal offense in Iran. These women were doing it on camera, posting the footage and daring the regime to stop them. The protests were the largest. But what made 2026 different from every prior protest cycle was not their size. It was what the regime decided to do about them. On January 3rd, 2026, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei appeared on state television. He was not conciliatory. He was not measured. He called the protesters harmful individuals and rioters. He accused them of acting to please the President of the United States. He drew a line: "We will speak with the protesters, but the rioters must be put in their place." 6 days later, he put them in their place. The New York Times, drawing on sources inside the Supreme National Security Council and the presidential office, reported that on January 9th, Khamenei issued a direct order: crush the protests by any means necessary. The Supreme National Security Council issued a live fire directive. Security forces received the instruction to shoot, to kill, and show no mercy. Amnesty International's investigation confirmed what happened next. IRGC forces and Basij militia were positioned on rooftops, on the roofs of houses, mosques, and police stations, firing rifles and shotguns loaded with metal pellets at protesters below, specifically targeting their heads and torsos. DSHK heavy machine guns, designed for military combat, were turned on civilian crowds. A Tehran doctor told Time magazine that 6 hospitals in the capital alone had recorded at least 217 protester deaths in a single night, most by live ammunition. What followed on January 8th and 9th was, by every credible measurement, the deadliest 2-day massacre of protesters in modern history. Iran International, drawing on government sources, hospital data, eyewitness accounts, and testimony from Iranian doctors and cemetery workers who conducted a covert investigation inside the country, reported that at least 12,000 civilians were killed. Later investigations put the figure higher. Iran International's editorial board reviewed internal documents and published a figure of 3,600 killed. The UN Special Rapporteur on Iran stated that the toll could be as high as 20,000. The Sunday Times reported 16,500 to 18,500. Every figure, from the regime's own acknowledged several thousand to the highest estimates, represented an act of mass murder committed by a government against its own citizens. There was more. Amnesty International documented that families who came to collect the bodies of their children were charged bullet fees, payments demanded before the regime would release the remains. Some dead were falsely registered as Basij militia members despite families' protests. IRGC armed troops raided hospitals and shot wounded protesters inside medical facilities. Lawyers who tried to represent the detained were arrested themselves. More than 50,000 people were taken into custody, including children as young as 14. The regime imposed a nationwide internet blackout from January 8th, cutting Iran off from the world for the 3rd time in recent years, preventing documentation, preventing communication, and preventing the outside world from seeing the full scale of what was being done. President Pezeshkian, who had been elected in 2024 on promises of moderation and reform, went on camera and apologized. "I'm sorry," he said. "I couldn't do anything." 3 men arrested in January were executed on March 19th, with many others on death row. The regime announced a subsidy payment of $7 per month per person as a gesture toward the economic grievances, a number that tells you exactly how seriously the regime took the material suffering of its people. And through all of it, through the blood, the blackout, and the bullet fees, the rooftop chants continued. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched the airstrikes that changed everything. The compound of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was struck at 9:32 in the morning. Khamenei was killed. His daughter, his daughter-in-law, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren were killed. The chief of his military office was killed. Alongside him died Defense Minister Aziz Nasirzadeh, the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, 4 top intelligence officials, and a cascade of senior figures, approximately 50 senior officials, eliminated in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury. Mojtaba Khamenei, the Supreme Leader's second son, a 56-year-old cleric who had spent his entire adult life operating from the shadows of his father's security establishment, was in that compound when the missiles hit. He survived only because he had stepped into the courtyard minutes before impact. His wife was killed inside the building. His son was killed. His brother-in-law was, according to leaked audio subsequently verified by The Telegraph, decapitated in the blast. Mojtaba sustained severe injuries, a leg wound requiring multiple surgeries, burns to his face and lips, and hand injuries that made speech painful. He emerged from that morning's destruction as the last surviving senior figure of his father's inner circle. And within 8 days, the IRGC had installed him as the 3rd Supreme Leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The manner of that installation matters enormously, because it is one of the central reasons why the IRGC now faces demands for the leader they just created to resign or be replaced. The Assembly of Experts, the 88-member clerical body constitutionally responsible for selecting the Supreme Leader, was supposed to conduct a deliberate, consultative process. What actually happened, according to multiple members of the Assembly who subsequently spoke to Iranian opposition media, was a coercive rush job. IRGC commanders applied repeated contacts and psychological and political pressure to force a rapid online vote. 8 Assembly members publicly announced a boycott, citing the heavy pressure being applied. The building in which votes were being counted was bombed by US and Israeli strikes before the count was completed. And throughout the process, a key IRGC security figure named Ali Asghar Hejazi, who was embedded in the office of the Supreme Leader, was actively warning assembly members that Mojtaba lacked the qualifications for the position, that hereditary succession violated the founding principles of the Islamic Republic, and that installing him would effectively hand the country to the Revolutionary Guard and permanently sideline civilian institutions. That warning was ignored. The vote was pushed through. Mojtaba Khamenei became supreme leader, and Hijazi's prophecy came true within weeks. Since March 8, 2026, Mojtaba Khamenei has not made a single verified public appearance. Not one press conference, not one live broadcast, not one video. Authenticated, unmanipulated, confirmed by any independent body. The only visual the regime has produced is an AI-generated deepfake that went viral on April 5th and was subsequently debunked within hours by BBC Verify, Grok, and every major international news verification service. His statements have been read aloud by news anchors from static photographs. His voice has not been heard. His face has not been confirmed. Iran's own state broadcaster used artificial intelligence to fake the existence of their leader. That sentence should be repeated slowly and carefully. Iran's state broadcaster used AI to fake the public appearance of the supreme leader because the supreme leader cannot appear in public. Reuters, drawing on people close to his inner circle, confirmed that Mojtaba sustained severe facial and leg injuries in the February 28th strike. The New York Times reported that one of his legs underwent 3 separate surgeries and that he is awaiting a prosthetic limb. His hand required surgery. Burns to his face and lips have made speech painful. The Pentagon independently assessed that the new Iranian leader was wounded and likely disfigured. President Trump, when asked directly by a reporter whether Iran's supreme leader was still alive, said, "We don't know." Into this vacuum of invisible authority, 3 men have moved to fill the space. Analysts examining the current Iranian power structure have identified a ruling triumvirate. IRGC Commander-in-Chief Ahmad Vahidi, Supreme National Security Council Secretary Mohammad Bagher Zolgadar, and military advisor Mohsen Rezai. Al magazine's analysis, drawing on intelligence sources and diplomatic reporting, described these 3 men with blunt precision. All 3 are IRGC hardliners. All 3 want to continue the war. None has any incentive whatsoever to accept the U.S. negotiating proposal. According to Fox News, drawing on Iranian opposition intelligence, the power structure in Tehran has become what one analyst called a joint stock company of intelligence security criminals. Vahidi operates as a shadow supreme leader, his faction clashing directly with the faction aligned with Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the figure who led Iran's nuclear negotiations in Islamabad. Meanwhile, Zolgadar plays the role of what Fox News described as the hidden orchestrator, managing the tension between the other 2 factions, while ensuring that no decision of consequence occurs without the IRGC's approval. Iran International documented that Zolgadar's hardline oversight had become so aggressive that even limited diplomatic flexibility was being physically curtailed. On one occasion, Zolgadar's anger caused Hossein Taeb, a senior figure in Mojtaba's inner circle, to physically call the negotiating delegation back to Tehran from Islamabad mid-negotiation. This is not a government. This is a collection of armed factions wearing a government's uniform, fighting over the right to speak in its name. The question the topic headline raises, IRGC demands their leader resign, requires the full context of what demands looks like in a system where everything is conducted through indirect pressure, intermediaries, and institutional maneuvering rather than open political contestation. Iran International's most important May 2026 analysis asked a question that cuts to the heart of the regime's legitimacy crisis. Is Iran entering its Gorbachev moment? That reference to the Soviet leader whose attempts to reform an unreformable system accelerated its collapse is not rhetorical. It captures precisely the dynamic currently playing out inside the Islamic Republic's power structure. Within the IRGC itself, commanders appear split into at least 2 distinct camps. The Vahidi-Zolgadar faction is openly described by Iranian observers as favoring the continuation of conflict, the rejection of diplomatic concessions, and the maintenance of maximum pressure through the Strait of Hormuz. The opposing faction, aligned with Ghalibaf, favors a form of strategic flexibility, not because Ghalibaf is a reformist or a moderate by any normal standard, but because he believes the current course leads to destruction faster than any deal would. Despite their rivalry, both factions share one core objective: ensuring the survival of the Islamic Republic. Their dispute is entirely over methods. And that dispute, playing out in the absence of a functioning supreme leader who can adjudicate between them, has produced the functional paralysis that the United States has been watching in real time through its intelligence assets. The specific mechanism through which the IRGC has been applying pressure on Mojtaba, to the degree that he can receive and respond to pressure at all, involves the military council that Iran International described as having erected a security cordon around Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. This council controls access to him. It filters information reaching him. It manages what he can communicate outward. It has, in effect, created a prisoner in all but name out of the man it installed as the most powerful figure in the Islamic Republic. The question of whether Mojtaba is physically capable of governing, or whether he is being used as a constitutional fiction to legitimate decisions made entirely by others, is one that neither the IRGC nor the regime's state media will acknowledge. But the constitutional provision that gives the IRGC's pressure institutional weight is Article 111 of Iran's own constitution, which grants the Assembly of Experts the power to dismiss a supreme leader who lacks the administrative capability to rule. Multiple reports from opposition and intelligence sources suggest that rival hardline factions are already maneuvering around this provision, quietly positioning themselves to exploit Mojtaba's absence and incapacity to declare him legally unfit and install a new figurehead more suited to their interests. This is not democracy. It is not reform, but it is the closest thing to a resignation demand that the Islamic Republic's internal mechanics allow. Institutional actors using constitutional language to undermine a leader they installed and now find inconvenient, and driving every single calculation inside that power struggle, sharpening every faction's urgency, shortening every timeline, making every day of continued impasse more dangerous than the last, is the economic catastrophe that nobody inside Iran's leadership can deny, discuss openly, or fix quickly. Let us talk about numbers for a moment, because numbers do not lie the way that state television does, and the numbers coming out of Iran right now are among the most alarming economic indicators recorded for any country not in active civil war. The International Monetary Fund projects Iran's real GDP will shrink by 1% in 2026. Consumer price inflation is officially projected at 68. 9%. And some current indicators suggest the real figure is running considerably higher. Food inflation reached 105% by February 2026. Bread and cereals are up 140%. Oils and fats up 218%. The Iranian rial, which was already at crisis levels before the war began, crossed 81 million per US dollar in late April, rising nearly 8% in a single day. The combination of the Strait of Hormuz blockade cutting off Iran's own exports, the U.S. counter-blockade of Iranian ports from April 13th, and the destruction of petrochemical infrastructure by U.S.-Israeli airstrikes has essentially severed Iran's primary source of foreign exchange. Iran's central bank governor urged President Pezeshkian to pursue peace urgently, including by restoring internet access. Senior economic officials warned Pezeshkian that rebuilding will take more than a decade. IRGC and Basij personnel in the field were, according to operational reports received by Iran International, experiencing acute shortages of food, hygiene facilities, and sleeping quarters. Some units were being fed expired rations. Soldiers were buying meals from civilian restaurants with their own money. Iran's largest steel producer, Mobaraka Steel Company in Isfahan, has over 27,000 workers in limbo following airstrikes that paralyzed its operations. These are not background conditions. They are the material foundation of the IRGC's internal power struggle. Because when soldiers go hungry, when state salaries become worthless overnight, when the economy is collapsing at 140% food inflation, the men holding rifles in the streets below apartment buildings in Chitgar are not just enforcers of ideology. They are also people whose families cannot afford rice. And every IRGC faction competing for control of the invisible supreme leader understands that a system this economically broken has a very short window before the enforcer class itself stops showing up. That window, not ideology, not theology, not geopolitics, is the real clock that is running on the Islamic Republic right now. Through all of the regime's internal turmoil, the factional warfare, the ghost supreme leader, the presidential lockout, the ceasefire negotiations, the Iranian people have not stopped pushing back. They have simply adapted their methods to survive against a security apparatus that has demonstrated it will kill unlimited numbers of people to maintain control. After the January massacres, large-scale street protests became impossible in most urban centers. The Basij checkpoints that went up across Tehran and provincial cities in the first days of the war were impossible to walk through in organized numbers without being detained or shot. So the movement moved upward, to rooftops and windows, to the dark above the checkpoints where no security barrier can reach. Every night, in residential buildings across Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, and dozens of other cities, Iranians have stood at their windows and chanted, "Death to Khamenei, death to Mojtaba, death to the IRGC." The Chitgar district video, the one that opened this script, was one of dozens documented across the spring of 2026. Security forces below fired upward toward buildings from which chanting could be heard. People were shot at through their own walls. And still the chanting continued. Because what is the alternative? Silence is acquiescence to a government that has killed your neighbors. Then came the universities. On February 21st, 2026, a second major wave of protest erupted at the start of the new academic semester as students returned to campuses across Iran for the first time since the January massacres. Al Jazeera documented the scene at Iran's top universities, the University of Tehran, Sharif University, Amr Kabir University, and Shahid Beheshti University, as clashes broke out between anti-establishment students and IRGC-affiliated Basij members on campus. Students chanted, "Death to the dictator," "Freedom," and with each killed, 1,000 stand behind them. They tore down and burned the Islamic Republic's flag, raised the pre-revolutionary lion and sun flag, and physically confronted Basij units who had been deployed inside their own lecture buildings. Al Jazeera reported that students have wounds in their hearts, in the words of government spokesperson Fatemeh Mohajirani, one of the most candid admissions of the massacre's psychological impact to emerge from any official source. She acknowledged the anger. She then added that sacred things and the flag are two of the red lines that we must protect. Mohajirani was describing, in the same breath, both the wound and the threat of punishment for expressing it. That is the governing philosophy of the Islamic Republic in May 2026. Acknowledge the grief and then threaten to arrest anyone who shows it publicly. The rooftop chanters, the university protesters, the 40-day memorial gatherings that turned into political rallies, the Nowruz fire festivals that became acts of collective defiance. None of these are expressions of a movement that has accepted defeat. They are expressions of a movement that has changed its tactics to survive and is waiting for the moment when the security forces below can no longer hear the difference between a rooftop and a street. The combination of the deadliest protests in Iranian history, the assassination of a supreme leader, and a 6-week war with the United States and Israel has produced a global response to Iran that is, by any historical measure, unprecedented in its scope and coordination. The European Union designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization on February 19, 2026, a decision that had been debated for years and repeatedly blocked by member states wary of the diplomatic consequences. The EU separately sanctioned 16 additional individuals and 3 entities for human rights violations in March. The UK, under its existing sanctions framework, designated 10 individuals, including the Minister of the Interior and police chiefs, in February. The United States Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control on April 30th designated 35 entities and individuals involved in Iran's shadow banking and sanctions evasion network, targeting the financial infrastructure that had kept the regime solvent through decades of pressure. Canada confirmed that IRGC officials were inadmissible to its territory. Australia imposed financial sanctions on 20 IRGC individuals and 3 entities. Albania formally designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization. At the United Nations, a record number of countries voted against Iran on a Security Council resolution demanding an end to attacks on Arab Gulf states and affirming freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz. Russia and China, Iran's supposed guarantors against such outcomes, chose to abstain rather than veto. The signal that sent to Tehran was unmistakable. You are more alone at this moment than you have ever been in the Islamic Republic's history. But the international pressure that matters most to ordinary Iranians is not the sanctions regime or the UN votes. It is the Starlink satellite internet service that the Iranian government's domestic blackout cannot reach. It is the BBC Persian service that 13 million Iranians, in a country of 91 million, access despite the official block. It is the diaspora communities in Munich, Toronto, and Los Angeles that held rallies of 250,000 and 350,000 people, respectively, ensuring that what happened in Iran was documented, amplified, and carried into the diplomatic discourse of every major Western democracy. The Center for Human Rights in Iran, writing in the Washington Post in March 2026, captured the regime's current posture precisely. The bombs are still falling, and the Islamic Republic's future is uncertain. But one thing is already clear. The Iranian regime is preparing for its next war, against its own citizens. Confronted with external military pressure on one side and an increasingly defiant internal population on the other, the Islamic Republic has chosen to fight both simultaneously. It is a choice that reveals both the confidence of a system that has survived every crisis before and the desperation of a system that no longer has any other option available to it. On January 9, 2026, Ali Khamenei ordered, "Crush the protests by any means necessary." Thousands died in 2 days. The regime cut the internet, charged bullet fees, and raided hospitals. On February 28th, Khamenei was killed by a U.S. airstrike. The son he always expected to succeed him survived because he stepped into a courtyard at exactly the right moment and emerged from that moment wounded, invisible, and governing through intermediaries in a system being run by 3 IRGC hardliners whose combined goal is the continuation of a war that has already destroyed their country. On March 31st, a plainclothes enforcer stood in a street in Chitgar. pointed a rifle with a green laser sight at apartment windows, and fired at the voices of ordinary Iranians chanting for their own freedom. That is the arc of the Islamic Republic in 2026, from massacre to assassination, from succession crisis to IRGC coup in all but name, from street protests to rooftop chants to university clashes, from a government with a supreme leader to a triumvirate of generals governing in the name of a man who cannot speak, cannot be photographed, and cannot be confirmed as alive. The IRGC, that is applying pressure, through constitutional maneuvering, through factional warfare, through the isolation of the man it installed at the top of the system, is not doing so out of principle. It is doing so because the system it has built is failing, because the war it started has produced catastrophe, and because the only way to survive the consequences is to keep moving the pieces fast enough that no one can assemble the full picture. But the Iranian people who chant from their rooftops in the dark have assembled it. The international human rights community that documented 36,500 dead in 2 days has assembled it. The UN Special Rapporteur who said the toll could be 20,000 has assembled it. In history, which the IRGC is desperately trying to revise on Wikipedia and on state television and in its forced confessions and in its midnight cartridge collections from city streets, will assemble the rest. Whatever comes next in Iran, deal or renewed war, succession or collapse, reform or further repression, it will be shaped by the extraordinary fact that the people of Iran, in the worst conditions their country has faced in a generation, chose to stand at their windows and chant rather than stay silent. That choice has not been extinguished by a rifle with a green laser sight. It has not been extinguished by an internet blackout, and it will not be extinguished by whatever the IRGC decides to do next. Subscribe, share this video, and hit the notification bell. Because the next chapter of this story is coming, and when it does, it will matter.